Recently in the media and in the Canadian political circles, the subject of the Canadian Indian Act of 1867 has come up again. The Assembly of First Nations has announced their desire to get rid of the Indian Act and replace it with a new modern one to deal with society as it is. Now, as I said, it was created in 1867, and there have been 18 amendments to it, the most recent occurring in 2000. Though it is very clear that this act has not fulfilled on many of the promises that it was intended to deal with. Housing, poverty, discrimination, equality, these things have not been taken care of, and rightfully so. The Assembly of First Nations has decided that this needs to be changed in order to move forward. Clearly, the act is outdated and a new one must be written. The main concern that the Assembly of First Nations has been expressing is that it needs to be geared more toward self-determination and more autonomy within the Canadian society. Right now, federal laws have a great deal of power over reservation land, and they seek to change that. They seek to have more autonomy within deciding what is to be done with land, how resources are to be organized, self-governance, and other such matters. Frankly, I believe, as many do, that more self-determination will go a great deal towards a more self-respect for the Aboriginal community, and not only that, it will take more steps towards undoing the damage that has been caused by the colonization of Canada by Western powers. AFN National Chief Sean Atleo had this to say concerning rewriting the Act. I believe there is both tremendous potential and urgent pressure on all of us as First Nation leaders to facilitate, support, and create real change in our communities. One of the ideas being tossed around is the removal of the federal government to be replaced with a Department of Aboriginal Affairs, with the inclusion of a person specifically there for enforcing Crown treaties. There have also been calls for a First Nations Ombudsman and Auditor General for there to be more accountability within the First Nations power structures. The current system set up by the current Act is not sufficient to deal with the problems facing Aboriginal communities, by which I'm referring to the Ministry of Indian Affairs. Now, this ministry has been severely inadequate when dealing with land claim issues, as we saw with the Caledonia standoff and many before that. A new system needs to be set up in order to properly deal with these situations. As it stands right now, the Minister of Indian Affairs really doesn't have any actual power, so is not able to affect that much change as a result of it. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that his not having any real power was intentional. Clearly, the system we have right now is not adequate for dealing with the issues facing the Aboriginal community. The rampant unemployment, health issues, self-determination, and systemic poverty. Despite a degree of autonomy and independence over the use of resources on reserves, they've not been able to take care of rampant unemployment and declining health standards. Once these casinos or other corporations dealing with resources have been set up, a small minority elite within these reserves all controlled by the band councils have been taking the money and keeping it for themselves instead of giving it to the community. This greed and corruption, much of it is centered around the chiefs themselves. There's an epidemic of corruption among chiefs, and not only that, an even greater problem when it comes to nepotism. The current system as it's set up right now is not adequate for dealing with this situation. I believe the problem is not so much the Indian Act, which definitely does need to be replaced, but the influence of capitalism over Aboriginal societies. This greed and all the other negative aspects which are promoted as good within capitalism are the main sources of these problems. The solution, I truly believe, would be a return to a more original Aboriginal culture. I'm not advocating primitivism. I'm advocating a return to the spirit. By that, the original societal belief held by the First Nations people. It's not one based on greed and corruption and money grubbing. It's one based on community. And only by returning to this and properly taking all resources and applying them as to actual need can a better society for Aboriginal peoples be created.